We're going live. Okay, we're all set.
Okay.
So, Jan Sewell, thank you for joining us. Uh, I guess the first question is, how do you turn Eddie Redmayne into Stephen Hawking, one of the most recognizable public figures of the 20th century?
God, I know. Well, when I got offered this job, I'd already done quite a lot of prep just to go for the interview, and I'd looked at lots of photographs. I knew Eddie. I hadn't actually made Eddie up before, but I'd worked on Les Miserables, and of course he was in it, and so I knew what Eddie looked like. And what I asked James, once he offered me the job, I asked James if we could do a makeup test very, very early on, because quite often makeup tests are done quite late, towards nearer the shooting day. And I wanted to do a makeup test to find our end point, because I knew where I wanted Eddie to go from being the young 21-year-old. And then I had to take him through the disease all the way through, and also a very small amount of aging, to make him end up in his mid-40s, late 40s, 25 years later. And once James had agreed to this, once Working Title were happy to pay for it, I then got Eddie's head shape taken, I got his face cast, and started talking to my wig makers, the people that make my prosthetics, because I do all three. I do hair, makeup, and prosthetics. It's so much easier, I feel, to create a whole character, because you're in control of it all. So very early on, we had this test, and I said to James and Eric, if we find what we want, that's fantastic, but what we'll find is what doesn't work. And in fact, the very first makeup test, we had very fine little prosthetics on. I'd had a head shape made to twist him. I had lots of mouthpieces made. I looked at the scale of his face. I had ears made to help scale his face down, because as the disease takes hold, it starts to twist your face, and I wanted to use this scale to get us right back down to where he was twisted in the wheelchair. And so the very first test, it just worked. You know, Benoit lit it beautifully. It worked. We refined it because Eddie had already started working quite closely with Alex Reynolds, who's his movement coach. And so already he was starting to twist his body, bend it, bend his head. And it was very important to make sure that when we put these really fine little prosthetics on, that with his head bent, they didn't rub on them. And so that's the way we found it. So I found the end point. I knew what the beginning was. I knew what I wanted Eddie to look at the beginning. I knew it would be a wig. I knew I'd have to make him look nice and fresh, young 21-year-old. And then we had the 2 points, and then we could work out a timeline all the way through.
Right. And of course, like every movie, this is not shot in sequence. So can you talk about the difficulty of that? How did you deal with that?
Well, quite rightly. I mean, it's not shot in order. So some days we had maybe even 3 looks. I might have the young, 21-year-old. We might go, near towards the end, and then have to come back again. Eddie is just amazing. He's the most amazing person. He's very observant. And I had my timelines worked out. All my prosthetics were made. I had little earlobe pieces that went on at certain times. We knew which mouthpieces belonged to which stage. I had 3 wigs made. I had the young wig, which was nice and big and floppy, and then a slightly lighter one, and then a more grey one towards the end. And I do a continuity book, I do a timeline book, where I can go into it and I know at each point where we are, which set of teeth it is, which mouth plumper it is, whether we've got the little earlobes on. And of course, you have these discussions with the first AD when they give you, the order of the day, and you say to them, you're much better off shooting that scene first and then that scene, because then I do less makeup changes, Right. So it was completely mapped out.
Right. And I read somewhere in here about basically one of the ways that you gave him just the slightest bit of distortion is to give him bigger ears. Is that right?
Yes, it is, because again, working towards making him look like he's shrinking, because we all worked really close together. You know, Stephen Noble did the costumes, and JP who did the set design, so therefore he was in control of the wheelchairs. It's about proportion. So while Stephen was making his clothes slightly bigger, and the wheelchairs were getting slightly bigger, I then had to do something similar to his face. So, as I say, it started off with me just adding little earlobes, and then when we got towards the end, we actually put full ears on him, because he always wore little ear clips, which clipped out his ears, because Stephen Hawking's actually got quite big ears, you know, compared to Eddie. And so by making the ears look bigger, and by putting the mouthpieces in, it made it look like, and also put head shape on him, it made it look like his face was shrinking and starting to distort. So it was all proportion, very subtle bits of proportion. And in fact, even when I watched the movie for the first time, I hadn't noticed the changes, because our aim was to do a very subtle change all the way to the end. And it's not until that lovely point in the movie where you roll back that you actually see how much has been done, which of course was the plan.
Right, right. And now, talking about Felicity Jones, she has a much subtler progression in the film, and yet you still have to age her. Can you just talk a bit about that?
Yes, now Felicity's lovely and a very beautiful young girl. So I was worried about how much we aged her. I mean, Felicity doesn't like wearing full wigs, so we're always using her hair and putting hair pieces on, but we always use the front of her own hair. But if you looked at the real Jane, she had aged very nicely herself, and you know, and she's a very strong woman, and she's very beautiful, and she still colours her hair. So in aging Felicity, the 25 years, I did it much more subtly on purpose, because the real Jane didn't age dramatically. We used latex under her eyes. We did test putting prosthetics on her, but they just didn't work. And this is what I mean about early testing. They just didn't work. They were too much. You saw them. You saw them. So there was no point. So I used Felicity as my period timeline. You know, with Eddie, you can't really show that you're in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But with Felicity, we could. So I used Felicity with her hairstyles to not only take us through the 60s and the 70s. So her hair changed from being, you know, a lovely little kind of twist, 60s twist, an Audrey Hepburn look, in the May Ball, to when, you know, she goes into the 70s where her hair gets longer, and then we go to the 80s and it gets shorter again. And then very subtly, again, her makeup was faded down a bit towards the end, where we then put on fine latex under her eyes, shaded her in, used a slightly more old-fashioned hairstyle. And so she was my lovely timeline to make people hopefully see the different stages and different years. And similarly, I did the same with Jonathan, because he, you know, Charlie Cox, because he spent most of his time in her timeline, I aged him very subtly as well.
Right, and I don't think a lot of people notice that, because the work is so subtle, and thereby, I think, effective. You know, can you talk a bit about the differences of doing more subtle makeup as opposed to more dramatic makeup, like the kind that you would have to do on Eddie for this film, or even in something like Les Mis, where you have a lot of grime and dirt and things like that?
Well, my take on doing my job is that it shouldn't be seen. I don't want someone to see the makeup. That's why when I have discussions with directors, I'll say to them, I'd rather underdo it than overdo it and see it. I'd rather not quite do enough than do too much, because for me, you shouldn't see the makeup. That is when it's most successful. And that's why in this film, I think the rollback is such a clever thing, because I don't think you would have seen my work unless you'd seen it go backwards. And I just think that you know, I've worked on very big films where you do need to see makeup, and I've put prosthetics on which you need to see because you're doing big aging, or you're doing an alien creature, or you've got lots of prosthetics where people look like they're beaten up, and you can see that makeup. But I think when you're talking about a subtle period story, we started, it's based in Cambridge, it's with intellectuals, it's not swinging London 60s. I think the whole film needed a very fine for it to work.
Right, definitely. Well, thank you very much. I think that's all the time that we have. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. This was certainly very informative. And congratulations on the film.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you. Nice to meet you.
It was lovely meeting you too. All right.